Hello everyone, back tuning into the fourth and final Spring 2019 Analogues update from GazWesterly.com. So we've done three updates in terms of Spring Analogues so far. This is the fourth and final one. Very shortened season of Analogues updates for the spring due to the shutdown that happened earlier in the winter at NOAA. So we are very short on time, and this is just going to be the fourth and final Analogues update for the spring of 2019. And I'll get on with that for you very shortly. Just say that coming up later on today, we're going to have the GazWesterly Sunday Roundup, so that will be with you after lunchtime. And probably doing a final Ensembles watch this evening. I think after that, probably rest those until next winter. Big thank you to James Ackwill for getting our analogues together for us. So James, of course, our analogues guru at GazWesterly. So big thank you to James for bringing together all of the analogues. Going to be quite a long video as usual with the long range stuff. So if you can't watch only one go, don't worry, it will be kept at the website indefinitely. There will be a written summary that goes with it as well in place on the spring updates page. Later on today, probably this evening, and you'll be able to have a read of that and also have a watch of the video on demand whenever you want. We're very late. I'm recording this at 10:30, much later than I would normally be recording, so I better get on with it and sit back and enjoy it. So we're going to start off by having a look at ENSO for our next batch of analogues. So we've had a weak El Nino through the winter of 2018-2019. So the first thing we've got to look at is springs that follow weak El Nino and return back to ENSO neutral through the spring. That's the most likely course that it's the most likely course that this spring will take. So ENSO, of course, is the cyclical warming of the equatorial Pacific Ocean from Peru over towards Indonesia. Now, you see, this was a very, very weak El Nino indeed. This is from the 3rd of the 1st of January. It's this area here that is sort of yellow, orange, red, or yellow and orange, there's no red. So that is a very, very weak signal for an El Nino event. And so we've had a really weak El Nino through this winter, barely registering as an El Nino, really. In fact, it is possible that it won't ever get designated. So the first thing we've got to look at is springs that are following weak El Ninos and reverting back to ENSO neutral. So the first spring that we're looking at is the spring of 1866. This is our first spring that is following a weak El Nino and then going back to ENSO neutral through the spring. The spring of 1866 looks like this. It has an area of above average heights up to the north, has below average heights to the south of the country, and we're bringing in an easterly wind. So probably quite a chilly spring, this one. Although, bear in mind, easterly winds in March are going to be quite cold, but by May, easterly winds probably not overly cold, really. The next spring is the spring of 1869. So the warmest winter on record, interestingly, the winter of 1868-1869 was a weak El Nino winter. The spring of 1869 following that weak El Nino winter, the warmest winter on record, that is going back to ENSO neutral. And it's an unsettled spring as well, with an area of below average height centred over the top of the UK and much of Northern Europe as well. Quite a cool spring too. The jet stream is going down there somewhere. So much more unsettled spring in 1869. Our next spring is 1885. So again, this is going from weak El Nino in the winter to ENSO neutral in the spring. This one really unsettled, below average height, centred over the top of the country. Bit of a blocking seal up to the northwest as well. That could be a rather colder spring with the jet stream taking a more southerly track. Then 1886 comes next. The spring of 1886 looks like that, with low pressure out to west of the country, and again we're bringing in those west to southwesterly winds. That's a milder but unsettled spring. 1906 comes up next. So again, we're going from weak El Nino to ENSO neutral through this spring. This one has above average heights out to the west of the country. It has an area of high pressure out to west of us, low pressure to the north and to the south. The jet stream going to be going something a little bit like that. So probably quite a lot of settled weather through the spring of 1906, and probably quite chilly as well. Spring of 1912 turns up next. This one looks like an unsettled, a relatively mild spring, really. We've got below average heights in the Atlantic and into the UK, and we're bringing in those westerlies rather like that. So it's a westerly spring, but probably quite unsettled in 1912. 1914 turns up next. So this is turning up a lot in our analogues. Excuse me, for the spring this year. This one with below average heights over and to the north of the country. So it's unsettled spring, but it's quite mild. It's bringing the wind in off the Atlantic, so no problems with temperatures, just mild and quite unsettled in the spring of 1914. The next spring is 1924, where we're going from weak El Nino to ENSO neutral, with below average heights over the country, bit of a blocking signal up to the north. Although there is northern blocking, I don't think it's a particularly cold spring, because actually the flow is probably in from off the Atlantic. So again, that's quite an unsettled spring, and despite the northern blocking, I don't think it's a particularly cold spring either. Then quite a long gap to 1952. So the spring of 1952 is much more settled, actually. It has above average heights over and to the east of the country, with below average heights in the Atlantic. And we're bringing up quite a mild sort of southerly southwest wind. There is a late blizzard at the end of March 1952, but otherwise this spring probably has quite a lot of dry and settled weather associated with it. 1959 comes up next. So again, this is a ENSO neutral spring that is reverting to ENSO neutral from weak El Nino. This one has high pressure over Scandinavia, so probably quite an east-southeasterly spring, blocking off the Atlantic. So I think a lot of dry weather through the spring of 1959, and quite warm as well. It's quite a warm spring in 1959, setting the scene, of course, for the very extended summer of 1959, hot summer. Then we're through to the spring of 1970. This one's a rather colder and more unsettled spring. It has above average heights out to the west of the country, with below average heights to the east. There's quite a lot of northerly winds in the spring of 1970. March 1970 was particularly cold. 1977 comes next, so this one has below average heights in over Scandinavia, above average heights out to the northwest of the country, and the flow is going something a bit like that. So a fair amount of dry weather and quiet weather through the spring of 1977. I think that was quite a pleasant, quite a mild spring. Then up to 1978, this one more unsettled, below average heights through the country. A little bit of a northern blocking signal as well. There's a very poor summer in 1978. The spring was quite cool and quite unsettled as well. Then a long gap to 1995, so the spring of 1995, following the weak El Nino winter of 94-95, going back to ENSO neutral in the spring of 1995, has above average heights out to the west of the country, below average heights up to the northeast. Wind in from a north-northwesterly direction. Quite a cool March, and there was a bit of a cold snap in April of 1995 too, but otherwise quite a warm spring, particularly warm, particularly hot actually, at times through May 1995. 2003 is our next analogue. This one again with a large area of above average heights over Scandinavia, and we're bringing in these mild or even warm southerly southeasterly winds. That's setting the pattern of the summer, the hot summer of 2003. Of course, the spring of 2003 has lots of dry and warm weather as well. 2005 next. This one again quite anticyclonic. Bit of a blocking signal up towards Greenland. Above average heights extending through the west of Europe, Atlantic blocked off out here. This has quite a cold start to the spring. Early March 2005 was pretty cold, but then the second half of March and the rest of the spring was generally quite mild. 2007 comes up next. This is our final spring for this batch of analogues. And this one, again, with quite a strong anticyclonic signal. High pressure is through the country. Low pressure is out to the northwest. But jet streams off at best on the warm side of the jet. We're under a ridge of high pressure through much of this spring. So pretty dry and warm. Exceptionally dry and exceptionally mild or warm in April of 2007. It all starts to flip, though, in May. This doesn't tell you that May 2007 turns cold and wet, and so we start to generate northern blocking and push the jet stream southwards. But through most of the spring of 2007, pretty dry and pretty warm. Putting all of those years together, where we're going from a weak El Nino to ENSO neutral through the spring. This is how March is coming out. So a rather unsettled signal in March, with below average heights generally to the south and the west of the country. Bit of a blocking signal up towards Greenland, although I'm not sure it's aligned particularly well to give us cold weather, actually. I would suspect we're generally fairly mild with most of these marches, but quite unsettled. Bear in mind, a lot of the later years within this analogues package would generate quite mild and dry marches in the later years. April looks like this. It looks like a pleasant signal for April, with above average heights generally close to the country. A lot of dry weather would be expected in the Aprils combined. May more unsettled. May generally has a trough of below average heights centre close to the country. Jet streams going through something a little bit like that. So in the Mays, it could be quite unsettled. Could be fairly coolish as well, I think, in a lot of those Mays. And if you put it all together, these are how the springs are coming out. So quite an unsettled signal for the spring. But I think that's a lot to do with what's happening in March. Actually, April, we know, has quite an anticyclonic signal, and just bring the jet stream through. So not particularly cold with these springs, but quite unsettled. Now, the other thing we've got to look at is the possibility that we'll never have El Nino designated, because there's been such a borderline El Nino. It's possible we'll never get this El Nino actually designated. So this is the cold and warm episodes by season chart. If we scroll down, it's showing every La Nina and El Nino, every cold and warm event back to 1950. You scroll down to 2018, you can see what's happened during 2018. So to get an El Nino designated, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you get El Nino designated. You have to reach half a degree or more above average and run that over 5 tri-monthly periods. So, for example, this tri-monthly period just here, which is for August, September, October, that would not count as an El Nino because it's actually under half a degree above average. It's 0.4 of a degree above average. So that wouldn't count. Neither will this, 0.2 above average, and nor will these two, both coming out at 0.1. So it's these 3 just here that get us to the required El Nino temperature threshold: 0.7 degrees above average for September, October, November, 0.9 degrees above average for October, November, December, and 0.8 degrees above average for November, December, January. That's only 3 though, so we've got to do that for another 2 tri-monthly periods. These ones just here will be the 2 that are important to get this El Nino designated and to get the numbers going red in the boxes. So what could happen is that these next 2 tri-monthly periods that we've got here, they might show a drop, because what we see is that we go from 0.7 there to 0.9 there, strengthening, but then this one, November, December, January, actually weakens ever so slightly, goes from 0.9 to 0.8. So if any of these 2 come out under 0.5 degrees above average, we will never get this El Nino designated, and what we'll say then is that this was a ENSO neutral winter, but on the positive side, and there have been a few times when that has occurred. So our next batch of analogues is looking at ENSO neutral, but on the warmer side of ENSO neutral, and then going to proper neutral conditions in the spring. Hope you're able to follow this, it's quite complicated. So our next spring is the spring of 1896, with above average heights out to the west of the country. Just quite a quiet spring, this one. A lot of dry weather, I would have thought, with blocking off the Atlantic. There's no particular area of low pressure. So a fairly quiet spring. Temperatures probably close to average. I think that's quite a nice spring in 1896. The next spring is 1901, where we've had a positive ENSO neutral winter, so a warm ENSO neutral winter, and the spring itself is ENSO neutral. This one with below average heights to the south, above average heights to the north. That could be a rather colder spring, perhaps bring the wind in more from an easterly direction. The next one is 1920. This one's an unsettled spring. Below average heights are out to the west of the country. We're bringing in the winds from off the Atlantic, so quite mild, wet and windy. Then we've got 1929, interestingly. So this is following a really cold winter in 1928, 1929. And it looks like this one just continues the pattern of the winter, really. So we get this blocking up to the north around Iceland, would be favouring bringing in cold east or northeasterly winds. So that's a fairly dry spring, but quite a cold one as well. Then we've got 1936, this one with blocking areas of high pressure up to the north and below average heights down to the south of the country. So I would have thought a lot of the easterly winds coming in with that one. Fairly dry winter though, fairly dry spring in 1936. And then a long gap through to 1991 with above average heights almost centred over the top of the country. So the spring of 1991, very dry and quiet, and fairly warmish spring as well, or fairly mild spring in 1991. 2004 has above average heights sitting up to the north of the country. Again, a lot of easterly winds going on here in the spring of 2004. Has quite a cold start to March, and then it gets reasonably mild through the rest of spring 2004. That's all there is for these positive ENSO neutral winters to ENSO neutral in the spring. So putting it all together, March is coming out like this. It's a settled signal for March with above average heights centred very close to the country, below average heights down to the south. Probably quite a warm signal as well, or a mild signal bringing in wind from a southeasterly direction. April, excuse me, April has above average heights in the middle of North Atlantic and going to our north with below average heights to the east. Could be a rather cooler signal, perhaps for April. Not particularly unsettled, although there's a trough there to our east because the Atlantic is blocked off. I don't think they're particularly unsettled April, but they could be a bit on the cool side. A nice signal for May. Look at this. These look like pretty decent springs, I have to say, with above average height centred almost over top of the country. You would expect quite a lot of easterly winds with that, but of course May is an easterly month anyway, so you get a lot of dry and pretty warm weather in May. And then we go through to the all years combined for the springs of 1896, 1901, 1920, 1929, 1936, 1991 and 2004. And looks okay, really. We've got above average heights sitting over and to the north of the country, below average heights to the south. If that was a winter chart, it would be a winter analogue chart, would be signaling a cold, a cold winter. But because it's spring, transitional, actually that could just be quite pleasant, really. You get a lot of easterly winds. By the time you get through to May, they could be quite warm as well. So overall, I don't think these ENSO analogues are too bad at all if you're looking for a more pleasant spring. I think there's a lot in there to suggest we could have quite a nice spring on the way. Last thing we're going to deal with for this analogues update is the QBO, the quasi-biennial oscillation. I'll get on with those analogues for you very, very shortly. You're going to pause the video there, going to get yourself a drink of water. We'll meet back in around meet back in around 2 seconds time, and we'll go on through the westerly QBO, or developing westerly QBO analog. So see you very shortly. Right, we're back, and we're ready to resume our fourth and final Spring 2019 Analogues update. So the last thing we're going to look at is the QBO, the quasi-biennial oscillation. We are in a developing QBO phase at the moment, an ascending QBO phase, if you like, going into the westerly QBO. So we're going to have to look at springs that have been developing or ascending westerly QBO springs to match up with the spring of 2019. Haven't shown you this for a very long time in videos. This is from the University of Berlin website. If you've been watching videos for a while, you'll know what this is showing. So this shows all of the QBO, quasi-biennial oscillation events going right way back into the 1950s. Where we've got the grey areas just here, these are, of course, the westerly QBOs. Where you've got the white areas, those are the easterly QBOs. So, for example, from 1982 to 1983, we have a westerly QBO. And then from 1983 to 1984 into early 1985, we have an easterly QBO, dates along the bottom. Of course. Now, the QBO is kind of like a strengthening and weakening of the zonal westerlies, the zonal flow in the northern hemisphere. So when you're in a westerly QBO, you're typically strengthening the zonal winds, the zonal westerlies. When you are in an easterly QBO, you are typically weakening the zonal winds and the zonal westerlies. So it's one of the main things that we look at in the winter. It's particularly important for winter forecasting. I think for other seasons, it's a little bit dubious about how much effects it has, but it is one of the things that we do like to factor in when we're doing long-range forecasts, not only for the winter, but for the other seasons as well. So if I scroll you down to the very latest, this has been updated for around a year, but they have finally started updating this now. So this is the current year, from 2018 into 2019 just there. You see we've got this grey area descending down through the atmosphere. You kind of like think of that to being the very top of the atmosphere, 10 HPA, that being the very bottom down on the surface where we are. So you can see how these events descend through the layers of the atmosphere, if you like. That's where we are right now. So we have got westerly QBO down to the boundary level of the atmosphere where weather is taking place, around 30 to 50 HPA. This is the important area just here. So we are in a westerly QBO. And this westerly QBO is going to continue, and it will continue to strengthen through the spring and into the summer. So just as we see here, 2010, 2011, for example, that is a developing, ascending westerly QBO until around the middle of 2011, and then it's a weakening sort of westerly QBO. So we're in an ascending westerly QBO at the moment. We're developing this westerly QBO, and that will be the case through this spring as well. So the years where we was in a developing westerly QBO during the springs, these are the all-important years, starting with 1955. This spring has an area of above average height centered over top of the country. Lots of dry weather in the spring of 1955. The Atlantic is blocked off out here, and the flow and the jet is going something like that. So it's a dry and quite warm spring in 1955. The next spring is 1961, where we're in a developing westerly QBO. This one again has above average height centered over to the south of the UK. The Atlantic is blocked off once again. The flow and the jet is going something like that. So these two springs are dry and warm generally in a developing westerly QBO. The next spring is 1969. This one is colder and more unsettled. It has quite a strong blocking signal up to the north, with below average heights over and to the south of the UK. The jet stream's a bit to our south as well. So this was a rather more unsettled and potentially slightly colder spring in 1969. 1971 is the next spring, that is in an ascending westerly QBO. This one, again, with above average heights centred quite close to the country, this time more out to the north, to the west of us, below average heights down the south. A lot of dry, quiet and fairly pleasant weather in the spring of 1971. 1973, also with quite an anticyclonic signal. Above average heights this time are centred out to the west of the country. Below average heights are to the east. And we're bringing winds in rather like this. So it's a relatively pleasant, relatively mild spring in 1973 with quite a lot of dry weather as well. 1978 next, so this is tying up with both westerly QBO and the earlier Analogues package we just looked at for spring. In terms of the weak El Nino going back to ENSO neutral potentially. So again, reminder of 1978, it has below average heights quite close to the country, above average heights are up to the north. It's a rather cool and rather unsettled spring in 1978. 1980 comes up next as a developing or ascending westerly QBO spring, strengthening, if you like, westerly QBO spring. This one again, quite an anticyclonic spring. I think that is a trend with a lot of these springs to be fairly anticyclonic and to have high pressure quite close. As in this case, the high pressure is kind of like to our north, with low pressure more towards the south and southeast. Probably bringing in rather cool easterly winds with this one. But again, fairly dry, I would have thought, in the spring of 1980. Spring of 1985 looks like that. It has below average heights over into the south of the country, a blocking signal up to the north. This is quite a cold spring in 1985, quite unsettled, quite cool. It follows on from a very cold winter, though, in 84-85, and I suppose a lot of that in the spring of 1985 is probably just the pattern of the winter lingering on to some degree into the spring. 1990 is next, and it's another anticyclonic one. This one again with above average heights close to us, this time over and to our south, with below average heights up to the north. The jet stream is up there, so on the warm side of the jet, this is a dry and warm spring in 1990. And then we go through to 1995, again tying up with the earlier analogues we just looked at in terms of El Nino. So the developing, strengthening westerly QBO in the spring of 1995 has an area of above average heights out to west of us, below average heights to our east. So again, there are northerly snaps, particularly in March and April, but it's a very dry spring in 1995, and it does get quite hot at times by the time we get through to May. Then we're into 1997, and this is another anticyclonic spring. Look at this time in the spring of 1997, we centre the area of above average heights over the top of the country. So again, lots of dry weather and warm in March and April of 1997. It does turn cooler and wetter in May 1997. The westerly QBO of 1999 comes up next. So this one, it's quite a warm spring really in 1999, although it does have an area of below average heights, kind of like close to the country. You'll probably think it's a fairly unsettled spring. It isn't particularly. There's a lot of dry and warm weather on offer in the spring of 1999. The next developing westerly QBO spring is 2002. So this one with the high pressure over Scandinavia and below average heights out to our west. It's a really quite a pleasant spring, this. It has plenty of southerly, southeasterly winds, plenty of dry and warm weather through the spring of 2002. 2004, again, quite an anticyclonic signal. These developing westerly QBO springs look pretty good, I have to say. There are very few of them that are really unsettled, and very few of them that are genuinely cold. Most of these developing westerly QBO springs are looking fairly dry and quite warm. The spring of 2004, also tying up with the earlier Analogues package, is a good example of that. Spring 2006 is quite interesting. This is a cool and unsettled spring, actually, with below average heights centred over to the east of the country, pulling in sort of cooler or colder northerly winds. That's a rather more unsettled and cooler spring in 2006, before we go into a very hot summer, of course. Then we're into the spring of 2008. This one also rather cool and unsettled. This one again with below average heights over to the east of the country, and really quite a strong blocking signal up towards Greenland. So the developing westerly QBO spring of 2008 is actually quite a cold spring, at least in March and April anyway. It does get pretty warm though in May of 2008. And then the last spring that coincided with a developing westerly QBO is the spring of 2013. And this is a cold spring. It's a very cold spring. Actually, it has the coldest March since 1883, I think, for central England. Other parts of the country, the coldest March since 1962. Loads of northern blocking up here. It has got below average heights over to the south of the country. It's not a particularly wet spring, funnily enough, but it is a cold spring, particularly so in March and through to early April. I think even May 2013 was a bit cooler than average as well. So we finish up with these developing westerly QBOs with a really cold spring. But generally, this Analogues package I think does look quite good if you want a settled spring. So this is how it looks. You put all those developing westerly QBO years together and look at all Marches combined. So in March we have above average heights centred to our north, below average heights to our south. Could be cold in March with that kind of setup. So maybe the Marches do favour something a little bit cold. But it's quite a strong blocking signal. It's centred towards Greenland. We're pushing the jet stream quite a long way south. The jet stream is going through there. So the Marches in these developing westerly QBO springs, they might favour something rather colder. But then April looks pretty good, really. In April, we tend to centre the area of high pressure right over top of the country. The jet stream goes rather like that. So the April's favouring a lot of dry and quite warm weather. And then we go through to May, and it takes the above average heights generally up to the north of us. No real trough of below average heights though, and of course this is going to be favouring bringing in easterly winds. And in May, I keep saying this, it's a transitional season, so in May easterly winds are not going to be particularly cold. So actually that's quite a good signal for May to be quite a nice, dry, pleasant and relatively warm month. Putting all of that together, this is how the springs themselves look when we're in a developing westerly QBO. Overall, it is an anticyclonic signal. It does favour the anticyclone being up towards Greenland, which is not a particularly good position. But you'll notice how the ridge extends through the country, and a lot of that's going to be down to what's going on in March as well. So just quite a lot of dry weather. The jet stream's down there. Plenty of dry weather on offer. And probably an increasingly warm signal after a fairly coldish start. Overall, I think these analogues are pretty good, I have to say. These QBO analogues are favouring a lot of dry weather through the spring. Pretty good if you want dry weather. Not everybody does, of course. But if you want dry weather, these analogues are decent. They're favouring quite dry springs. And I think, although the last couple finished up a little bit on the dodgy side in 2006, 2008, 2013, I think overall not too bad at all, really, with these developing westerly QBO analogues. So if you put them together with the ENSO stuff that we started off with, I think a fairly decent update, actually, this, to finish off with, and possibly suggesting a relatively dry and potentially quite warm at times sort of spring. Right, so that's it for the Spring Analogues update. It's been a very short season of updates. Sorry about that. It's purely down to the fact that we took December off, as we always do after winter updates. We need a little bit of a rest from the long-range stuff. So we took December off, not knowing, but in January we was going to be facing a shutdown of NOAA, and we won't be able to access the analogues. So if we'd known that, obviously in December, we would have done more analogues updates. Just the way things have turned out, the shutdown really did set us back a long way. But we have managed to get some updates done for you for this spring. And now we're going to put it all together. And along with the long-range seasonal models, we're going to try and come up with a spring forecast a week today, Sunday the 3rd of March. That's when we will be releasing the Galsworthy Spring 2019 forecast, so come back for that next Sunday. Coming up later on today, we've got the Galsworthy Sunday Roundup, and then I think we'll do one final ensembles watch for this winter this evening. That's all for now, and thanks for watching.